G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. 28th of January, it's a Sunday and Rear Visions are going to give us a little bit of a look at what happened after 26 January 1788.
Kerry Phillips. On the 26th of January 1788, the ships of the First Fleet started unloading the first of more than 1,000 people, convicted criminals, officers, marines, women and children, who would set up camp in what became the city of Sydney. How we remember this date has become the subject of debate, but it's not the subject of this program. Instead, we'll hear about the earliest days, weeks and months of contact between the British who arrived and the Aboriginal people who lived there as they engaged with each other across a cultural chasm. Dr. Shino Konishi.
I'm a historian at the University of Western Australia. I'm also Aboriginal, so I identify with the Yurru people of Broome in Western Australia. When the British arrived in 1788, they already had what they thought was enough knowledge about Aboriginal people gained from the accounts of the British explorer William Dampier, who landed in the northwest of Australia in 1688 and 1699. And then also the accounts of the Endeavour expedition, which visited New South Wales in 1770. So that was led by Captain James Cook, who then claimed New South Wales on behalf of the British Crown, which at that time comprised almost half of the continent and the islands to the east. So from those two accounts, we have similar but significant differences in the descriptions of Aboriginal people. So firstly, Dampier was very denigratory, and he's most famous in Australia for describing Aboriginal people as the miserablest people in the world. So to him, their sort of lack of material culture was, very significant. They didn't seem to be interested in trading any objects with him. They weren't interested in any of his belongings. So he was very dismissive. Then when Cook came, he had Dampier's depiction of Aboriginal people in his mind. And, he similarly noticed that he didn't see houses, although Joseph Banks, the botanist with him, did describe a village at Botany Bay, so it must have been a fairly extensive campsite there. And again, the Aboriginal people of New South Wales didn't appear that interested in trade. However, Cook did come to a different conclusion to Dampier. He felt that rather than this lack of material culture and interest in material objects, rather than that being a sign of their miserableness, he instead thought it meant that they seemed far happier than Europeans, because it meant that they didn't have any inequality in their society. So this didn't give way to any jealousies and iniquities. So I guess when the First Fleet arrived, they did have some idea about the material and technological culture of Aboriginal people. They sort of falsely believed from Cook that Aboriginal people only lived on the coast because they subsisted entirely on fish, which is what Cook thought. And so, they sort of didn't realise how rich and diverse Indigenous diets were. They did think that they were one people. It took them a while to recognise all the different languages and different cultural practices. They also thought because there were no obvious leaders, it wasn't a highly stratified society, as the British had witnessed in the Pacific Islands, for instance. So they felt that there was no one to negotiate with, and no sort of recognisable form of government or system of law, which contributed to Cook not negotiating with any Indigenous people before he claimed possession on behalf of the Crown. So they did come with the expectation that the land was available. And when the First Fleet arrived, the instructions didn't include any acknowledgement that Indigenous people may have owned the land or have any entitlements other than to be treated humanely.
I'm Professor Grace Karskens and I teach Australian history at the University of New South Wales. Phillip himself had instructions to conciliate the natives, as I'm using a quote there, to treat them kindly, and they were expected to be incorporated into British society. And this is really important because it explains why Phillip is so open-handed and friendly. He puts down his weapon when he arrives, They immediately trying to make contact with the local Indigenous people. They ask for water, and the Indigenous people point out, we even know where that stream is. So it's, we know where this all happened on Botany Bay, on the beach there in 1788. The thing that they don't realise is that Aboriginal people in the Sydney region are made up of many, many groups who may or may not get on with each other and have their own close-knit bands who move around certain territory and do interact with others and do have rights to other territory. And it's very complex, and the British have no idea about this, of course. They think they're all one people. And it's worse than that, because Cook and Banks, from their very short stay in Botany Bay, decided that the Indigenous people of Australia were weak, incurious, cowardly, and would run away. So that's the image that they came with. They thought these people would just move on. They wouldn't be a problem. And it's also very important to know that, because that is why they didn't make a treaty with them. They decided that the land was not owned by these people. They couldn't see any houses, any political organisation. They couldn't see any cultivation. Those are all the markers for British people of owning land. And of course, they couldn't see what was right before their eyes. Of course, Aboriginal people cultivate the land. They just do it in a different way. Of course, they have a political organisation. It's a very tight one. They couldn't see it. And they do build, but it's just that in this one area in Australia, they don't build very much, which is a historical coincidence, which had huge impacts. So the British come thinking they're going to lay claim to the territory and the Aboriginal people won't fight back because they don't own it and they're too simple. And nothing could be further from the truth. And that's what shocked them. In the first place, when they went around Botany Bay and then later Sydney Harbour, because Phillip was looking for a better place to settle, they encountered different groups, and they realised that they didn't have to make friends with one group of people and that would be it. They had to do it over and over again. Every time they met another group of people, they had to go through all the gift giving, the dancing, the gun demonstrations, which was what they also did. They wanted to be friends, but they wanted to show them what their guns could do, and that had a huge impact on Aboriginal people, as you would expect. So it's very complex for the British to try and understand, and they don't actually even realise that between, say, Sydney and the Hawkesbury, there are different languages. They don't realise that for 2 years. After deciding that Botany Bay wasn't a suitable place to settle, Arthur Phillip set off to find a better one. Phillip has taken his people and sailed up and rowed up into Sydney Harbour, and they pop in all over the place. They sail into Camp Cove and meet the people there, then they cross over to North Harbour. Everywhere they go, there are people on the cliff tops shouting at them, "Warra warra, warra warra," which doesn't sound like a welcome to them. It sounds a bit aggressive. Then they go to Manly, which is very, very important site in our early history, our early contact history. And there, about 20 very well-built warriors, well-armed, well-built, wade out to meet the boats. Now, if you're a British person and expecting them to be weak, cowardly and run away, this might be a little off-putting. And it was. They didn't even land. They didn't even come out of their boats because this was a bit of a standoff. So they had a bit of a parley with them and sailed away again. And finally, they find a snug little cove called, in Aboriginal language, Warrain, which later became known as Sydney Cove. And there is a beautiful stream of fresh water there. That's not the only fresh water stream in the harbour. They're all over the place. We have a map of them. But as far as I've been able to tell, and other historians, this is the only place. There are no Aboriginal people on the shore waving spears at them or shouting "Warra Warra." There's nobody there. And I think that that is why Phillip chose Sydney Cove.
I'm Professor Jacqueline Troy. I'm the Director for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research at the University of Sydney. I work in the Office of the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research. I'm Marigu, and my country is the Snowy Mountains of southeastern New South Wales. When the first fleet arrived, there were a lot of people actually down at the beach, if you like, on the edge of the harbour, which was a big surprise to Arthur Phillip and his other officers with him, because the expectation was that the country was almost empty of people. Because when Cook had arrived in 1770, he arrived in winter, and of course people were not down at the beach. They were away from the coastline, and sheltering because it's colder. And when Phillip arrived, of course, people were down at the beach, fishing, camping, and doing all the sorts of things that people will do in good, clement summer weather. So it was high summer, it was January. So because there were all these people around, instead of just the handful that Phillip was expecting, there was a lot of early interaction between both the people coming into Australia. I talk about the invading First Fleet, because effectively that's what they were. They were coming to take over the country of the Aboriginal people. So the first thing we know is that the British didn't have a very clear view, or if they did, they were ignoring the fact that Aboriginal people owned the country that they were in. There was a different understanding of, if you like, land ownership. So unless you were tilling fields and building big edifices and looking like you were quite sedentary in a British sort of a way, you were not seen to be land-owning people. So right from the start, it's quite clear that there were cultural differences, legal differences, differences of understanding of how people engage with the land and with country. This actually became pretty clear to the First Fleet very quickly, to Phillip as the governing officer and to his other officers, that actually these people had a very strong sense of ownership of the country. They were protective. When Phillip and his men cut trees down to build structures, the Aboriginal people of Sydney were horrified, because you don't cut a whole tree down. You might take its bark to make string or to make a shelter or something, or you might take some leaves, you might take some of the products that will regrow, but you don't destroy a resource by chopping it down. And so they were completely horrified by some of the ways in which these First Fleeters treated the country. And equally, Phillip and others found the way in which Aboriginal people treated the country difficult for them to deal with, because one of the things, of course, was to burn country. If you don't burn country, then you end up with the country changing quite dramatically very quickly. Our bush regrows very, very quickly. And a wonderful book by Bill Gamage about the greatest estate on earth talks about how, in fact, Aboriginal people very carefully landscaped the environment. And Sydney was, of course, part of that grand landscaping. There were kangaroo grounds where people hunted. Indeed, where Sydney University sits now was a kangaroo ground, a sloping area where people would hunt kangaroo and, if you like, farm them.
When Governor Phillip or Captain Phillip arrived in Botany Bay, for instance, he did come with the expectation that it was going to be rich for agriculture, which is what Joseph Banks had previously said when they had visited in 1770. So instead he found it completely unsuitable. So to British eyes, they were looking at the land as a resource to be cultivated, to enable pasturage, agriculture. And so when all of the convicts disembarked in Sydney Cove, David Collins, the judge advocate of the colony, he reported that everyone had to step down into woods, that there was no clearing, and so that their first action was to immediately start clearing the land. So for what British eyes, what they needed was open space in order to create their camps, create pens for the livestock and with available pasturage. And David Collins actually said that the abode of silence and tranquility that they encountered was now changed to that of noise, clamour and confusion. So I guess for British eyes, the woods was something that you needed to clear in order to discover the sort of actual resources they wanted, which is water, grasslands, plant foods that they could eat and use as medicines. Whereas to the Euro people's eyes, the environment would have been completely different. Wildlife, animals and birds would not have been purely just game to be hunted and eaten. Some would have been totems for different individuals and clans. So, for instance, there's one account of one of the First Fleet members shooting a bird and an Aboriginal man running forward and shouting at him, which in his own language, which the British man couldn't understand. But here we see a different point of view about this bird. Similarly, some accounts of the British chopping down trees and Aboriginal people rushing forth and sort of shouting at them about what they were doing. So I guess this notion of just wholesale land clearing that the British undertook was quite an affront.
That's very true. There's so many of them Professor Anne McGrath is the director of the Australian Centre for Indigenous History at the ANU.
And of course they had these huge nets where they just caught hundreds of fish at a time and planned to keep them to feed their own. And of course the Aboriginal people who had...
Okay, we're on the upload limit. Back immediately.